The instruction arrived before the palace household had completely stirred awake. Deep beneath the royal estate, a secured vault holding jewels once intended for Diana's future ceremonial position was unlocked under Princess Anne's authority. But the most shocking detail was not what Anne took from a vault. It was the name recorded in the refusal register. The Queen Consort had formerly been denied entry. Before we explore what this could mean for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. And walked inside without ceremony, holding a signed royal authorization and carrying a silence heavier than any public statement. The private royal vault was far more than an ordinary locked chamber. It served as a protected archive where ceremonial jewelry, historic gifts, and contested royal possessions were kept under tightly controlled permission. This was important because several pieces inside had originally been prepared during Diana's time as Princess of Wales for future state ceremonies and coronation-related responsibilities. They had become symbols of a royal future she never had the chance to fulfill. The central decision was unmistakably clear. Princess Anne had received authorization to retrieve Diana's designated coronation jewels and place them under her own custodial protection after Camilla's official request to access the collection was refused. Custodial protection meant Anne would determine who could touch, display, wear, or reassign those pieces. This was not simply a short-term security measure. It represented a shift in authority. And paused when the velvet cover was pulled away. Beneath it sat a sapphire and diamond piece Diana had once spoken about with her during a private conversation preserved in an old household record. For a brief second, the Princess Royal's usual discipline slipped. She touched the edge of the case, then slowly pulled her hand away, remembering the concern behind Diana's words, that one day everything associated with her could eventually be claimed by somebody else. Camilla received the notification while sitting at breakfast. She read the final sentence once and then read it again, almost as if seeing it twice might somehow change its meaning. The Queen Consort placed the document beside her untouched cup of tea and remained completely still. She immediately understood this was not a scheduling issue or some minor disagreement within the palace. The refusal had been formally entered into an official register, turning it into a permanent judgment against her request. But the denial contained an even stronger warning. Camilla's name had not merely been excluded from the approved access list. Beside it appeared a direct instruction. No access without the Princess Royal's presence and written consent. And read the sentence twice, fully aware that those words placed her directly between the collection and the woman seeking access to it. Then the atmosphere became even heavier. Beneath the inventory documents rested another sealed envelope marked with Diana's former household cipher, a private identifying mark. To the palace, the objects taken from the vault were diamonds, sapphires, pearls, and pieces of historic gold. To Anne, however, they represented fragments of a woman whose position in royal history had never been peacefully resolved. To Camilla, they represented legitimacy. And to Diana's sons, they carried the painful weight of a mother whose memory had survived every effort to contain it, and understood exactly why this collection could never be handled like an ordinary jewelry box. The pieces had been assembled during Diana's marriage for significant future ceremonies. They had been chosen to complement the royal regalia without officially becoming part of the permanent crown jewels. Royal regalia referred to the historic crowns, scepters, and ceremonial objects directly connected to the sovereign. These particular jewels were different. They belonged to a future Diana had once been expected to step into. Yet after that future disappeared, there was never a simple answer about who should ultimately control them, and had always been one of the royal family's strongest defenders of tradition. She rarely allowed emotion to guide her publicly, but she clearly understood the difference between legal ownership, ceremonial custody, and moral inheritance. Legal ownership determined who officially possessed an object. Ceremonial custody determined who had permission to use that object during official duties. But moral inheritance raised a far more difficult question, one that no legal document could completely resolve. Who truly had the right to carry the meaning attached to it? A private conversation from years earlier suddenly returned to and with painful clarity. Diana had once confessed that she feared the people who outlived her might eventually rewrite her story until nothing genuinely felt like it belonged to her anymore, and had listened at the time, but she had offered no reassuring promise. Back then, silence had seemed like discipline. Now, it felt like failure. Standing beside the transferred cases, Anne knew she could not change what she had failed to say years before. But she could still prevent Diana's fear from becoming reality. Camilla experienced the rejection in an entirely different way. Sitting alone after breakfast, She removed a pearl brooch and set it on the table beside the refusal notice. The Queen Consort stared at both items before quietly wondering whether she would always be regarded as a replacement instead of a queen. The jewels had become evidence that the monarchy still maintained a boundary between her and the woman who had come before her. William discovered the details of the transfer directly from Anne, rather than Charles. He listened silently until Anne mentioned a sapphire circlet that had been chosen years earlier for Diana's future state appearances. The prince turned away and tightened his grip on the back of a chair. He had learned over the years how to contain his grief in public, but hearing that particular piece mentioned suddenly made the loss feel painfully immediate again. And then disclosed that the vault records contained a custodial clause created before Diana's divorce. A custodial clause was a written condition determining who could control, manage, or reassign protected property. This particular clause appeared to prevent the collection from automatically passing to any future royal spouse. William asked who had attempted to bypass it, and gave no verbal answer. Instead, she pushed Camilla's rejected access application across the table. With no aides present in the room, William studied the signature at the bottom of the authorization document. His expression immediately shifted because the approval seemed to have originated from Charles's own private office. The rejected application had revealed something far more serious than Camilla's wish to enter the vault. It suggested the crisis had not truly started when Anne entered the vault. It had begun several months earlier beneath the chandeliers of a private palace rehearsal, when Camilla reached toward a sapphire necklace assigned to Diana's ceremonial archive. One quiet action brought the entire room to a standstill. Anne placed her hand over the jewelry case, shut the lid, and calmly informed her that the piece had not been released. Camilla had arrived expecting an organized fitting ahead of an important state anniversary. Royal dresses had prepared several historic pieces that could potentially be worn by senior women within the family. Every selection carried significance because jewelry at major royal occasions could communicate status, continuity, and public recognition. But the sapphire necklace carried greater importance than everything else in the room. It had originally been prepared for Diana's future ceremonial appearances and was later sealed following her death because no final determination had established who could legally, or morally, claim it. Camilla made the decision herself. She gestured toward the necklace and instructed one of the dresses to place it alongside her gown for that evening. The request sounded ordinary, almost casual, but Anne immediately recognized the consequences. The Princess Royal stepped forward, lowered the lid over the case, and instructed that the necklace be returned to storage. Nobody said a word. The silence made the refusal seem more powerful than any official palace announcement. Camilla immediately felt the embarrassment. Only a handful of people had witnessed what happened, yet they worked at the very heart of royal life, where seemingly minor moments could shape private reputations for years. The Queen Consort waited until the room had emptied before confronting Anne. She accused her of using Diana's memory as a weapon against a living woman who had already spent years trying to establish her position beside Charles, and remained firm. She told Camilla that she was not defending a memory. She was enforcing a written restriction. Those words changed the entire situation, and explained that a custodial clause was a binding instruction establishing who had authority to manage, release, or reassign protected possessions. The revelation left her furious because it meant the sapphire necklace had never actually been available for her use. The situation became more serious after the rehearsal. According to a documented palace account, an unidentified senior official requested that the restriction be reconsidered and declared outdated because Diana had never become queen. But the review did not remain merely theoretical. It created the route through which the access request and would later reject inside the vault could eventually be submitted. Charles received only a carefully softened summary of what had happened. He was informed that a ceremonial allocation dispute had occurred, a phrase designed to make the confrontation appear to be nothing more than a small disagreement concerning jewelry for an official event. The king was never told that Camilla had personally chosen the sapphire necklace, nor was he informed that Anne had been forced to close the case herself. After everyone had departed and returned to the room, she discovered the sapphire necklace still resting outside its case, and carefully lifted the piece, returned it to the velvet lining, and personally locked the box. When Charles eventually discovered what had truly happened during that rehearsal, he called both women to meet him without advisors. And the confrontation that followed would tear through years of carefully maintained royal restraint. There were no private secretaries, no legal representatives, and no carefully rehearsed palace statements. Charles sat at the head of the table while Anne and Camilla faced each other across the polished surface. The king asked one straightforward question. Had the sapphire necklace been intentionally selected despite the existing restriction? Camilla answered yes. Anne's response immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Charles had arranged the meeting after examining the vault transfer order and realizing that the disagreement was no longer simply about jewelry. It had developed into a test of trust, royal authority, and Diana's unresolved position within the monarchy. A transfer order was a formal directive that moved control of protected property from one custodian to another, and arrived carrying the original inventory, the rehearsal documentation, and the rejected access request. Camilla brought only the refusal notice, choosing not to rely on staff members or prepared explanations. Camilla looked directly at and argued that the palace could not continue treating Diana's possessions as sacred objects that no living woman was allowed to approach. The Queen Consort insisted that the sapphire necklace belonged to royal history rather than private sorrow, and that wearing it would have represented continuity instead of conquest. Anne's controlled manner suddenly became sharper. You were informed it wasn't yours, and you reached for it anyway. The words struck hard. Charles attempted to calm the discussion, but Anne turned toward him and demanded to know why his private office had authorized access without consulting her. The king looked down at the application rather than immediately responding. That hesitation altered Camilla's expression. Until then, she had assumed Charles knew precisely how the request had progressed. Charles carefully studied the signature and the official mark beside it. The delegated seal was an authorized stamp that allowed trusted members of staff to approve limited matters in the monarch's name when direct approval from the king was not considered necessary. Charles recognized the seal immediately. But he did not recognize the decision. The king made it clear that he had never personally approved the application and had never been shown the complete file. Camilla's confidence began to weaken. According to an account later preserved within the household record, she admitted that she had privately spoken with a senior advisor who had assured her the old restrictions could quietly be removed. She had been told that Diana's custodial clause was outdated, and that nobody would challenge the decision once the jewels appeared publicly during a state occasion, and demanded the advisor's name. Camilla refused to provide it. Charles asked again. This time, there was no softness in his voice. He told her that remaining silent would only protect the individual who had used his royal authority without his permission. The Queen Consort looked from the monarch to the Princess Royal before finally answering. The name belonged to an official who had worked for Charles for decades. Even more troubling, that same individual had handled sensitive household documents following Diana's death. As Camilla revealed the official's identity, Charles slowly lowered his pen onto the table and closed the file but kept one hand firmly resting on top of it while the king stared silently at the authorization page. The confrontation had exposed a deeply personal wound. But the unauthorized approval suggested something much colder, a concealed struggle inside the royal household over who possessed the authority to reshape Diana's legacy. The palace advisor had apparently believed that the passing of time had weakened Diana's claim. The custodial clause demonstrated exactly the opposite. Buried beneath decades of formal ceremonial wording was a direct instruction. The collection could not be worn, reassigned, or publicly displayed by a later royal spouse without written authorization from both the Princess Royal and Diana's eldest son, and had not taken authority for herself. She had discovered that the authority had already been given to her. Charles examined the agreement alone inside his study, now understanding that the vault dispute had been built around something much more serious than royal tradition. The confidential custodial agreement had separated several ceremonial jewels from possessions that would normally fall automatically under the sovereign's control. In simple terms, this meant the king could not release those jewels merely because they were associated with the crown. Their use had been placed under a separate promise, one specifically intended to survive changes in marriage, status, and royal responsibility. The agreement identified two moral custodians and represented continuity within the royal family. William represented Diana's direct legacy through her eldest son. Their shared authority was significant because the jewels carried both institutional and deeply personal meaning. One side protected the order of the monarchy. The other protected the woman whose life had given those pieces their emotional significance. Charles reached Diana's signature and suddenly stopped. The king removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against his forehead, and remained silent. Seeing her name transformed the document from an old legal safeguard into what appeared to be a final act of personal protection. Charles understood that the agreement had been prepared during a period when Diana's future within the monarchy had become uncertain. That uncertainty had forced her to protect what the royal family itself had failed to resolve. and entered the study without any sense of victory. She explained to Charles that she had not reclaimed the collection to punish Camilla or reopen wounds from the past. The Princess Royal had acted because approving the request would demonstrate that any protected promise could simply be erased whenever it became inconvenient. If one clause could disappear, then no private assurance made within the royal household could truly be trusted. And then there was the sealed envelope. Its contents made the truth even more difficult to ignore. According to the handwritten note inside, Diana wanted the jewels protected from ever becoming symbols of victory for another woman. Instead, she requested that they eventually be preserved for her sons' families and used in future public service. Her words were not filled with bitterness. That was precisely what made them so powerful. And placed the note in front of Charles but did not slide it toward him. Charles reached for it himself. He read the final sentence and carefully folded the paper along the same crease Diana had made years earlier. The investigation soon revealed deliberate interference. The advisor who had advanced Camilla's application had removed a copy of the custodial clause from the active archive, making the request appear straightforward and legally uncomplicated. Charles immediately ordered a complete household investigation and suspended the official from duty. But the action came too late. Someone had already copied the denial register, and evidence of Camilla's exclusion was beginning to move beyond the palace walls. By securing the jewels, and had protected Diana's final instruction. But outside the king's study, Camilla was about to discover just how quickly a private refusal could transform into public embarrassment. The first consequence arrived quietly. Camilla's planned visit to the royal collection disappeared from the household calendar. Then her jewelry advisor was denied entry to the archive. Finally, a sealed notification arrived confirming that every future request involving Diana's ceremonial pieces would require authorization from both Anne and William. The refusal was no longer a single decision. It had become an entire system. Camilla watched silently as the restrictions tightened around her. Access codes were replaced, archive appointments were cancelled, and custodial authority was officially transferred to Anne, with William appointed as co-approver. A co-approver was someone whose written permission had to be obtained before protected possessions could be moved, displayed, or worn. That detail was especially important because the Queen Consort could no longer appeal directly to Charles alone. Two separate guardians now stood between her and the collection. Charles approved the new measures while the household inquiry continued. The king insisted that the security and integrity of the vault had to be maintained, even if doing so caused embarrassment for his wife. He understood that the suspended advisor had exercised royal authority without permission. Any weakness now could suggest that private influence mattered more than written commitments. Camilla received the final notification inside her private sitting room. She dismissed the staff, shut the door, and carefully read every restriction without moving. Then she tore the first page halfway down. Her anger carried her only that far. She stopped, looked at the damaged document, and slowly placed the two sides back together, almost as though she were attempting to regain control over something that had already fallen apart. Camilla confronted Charles later that evening. The Queen Consort accused him of allowing Anne and Diana's memory to determine the limits of their marriage. She told him that every newly locked door made her feel like a visitor inside the life they had created together. Charles responded that the conflict was not about choosing Diana over her. It concerned an attempt to bypass a protected promise and then use his royal office to make that violation appear legitimate. But the most painful blow came from William. Through the signed transfer document, Camilla discovered that he had approved Anne's order without requesting a single alteration. His signature made the restriction permanent unless both custodians eventually agreed to reverse it. William had not simply supported Anne's decision. He had secured it. Then the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. A palace employee discovered a second application prepared by the suspended advisor. The document would have permitted the jewels to be photographed on Camilla before official approval had been granted. The apparent intention was to create public pressure that would make the transfer difficult to reject afterward. Charles reached toward the torn notice resting on the table. Camilla immediately placed her hand over it. She told him not to repair what he had allowed the palace to damage. Then she walked away, leaving Charles alone with the unsigned investigation order. Feeling betrayed by both Charles and William, Camilla requested a private meeting with Anne. No king.
No lawyers.
No household witnesses. The machinery of the monarchy had already delivered its consequences. But the true turning point could only happen when the two women finally faced one another without Charles standing between them. When Camilla entered Anne's private room, there were no documents scattered across the table and no guards positioned outside the door. Only a single velvet case rested between them. For the first time, neither woman communicated through Charles, royal protocol, or palace advisors, and opened the case. Inside rested the sapphire piece that had become the center of the entire conflict. Then Anne asked Camilla one simple question. Why did she truly want it? And had accepted the meeting because the disagreement was already slipping beyond private control. If the coppered denial reached the public before the family established the truth, every official palace statement would appear defensive. The Princess Royal wanted to hear the answer directly from Camilla herself, not through attorneys, advisors, or members of staff. The sapphire necklace had been placed there as evidence. It was not an offer. The piece carried the memory of the rehearsal, the rejected application, and the moment when one woman's desire for legitimacy collided with another woman's protected legacy. Camilla looked toward the necklace, but she did not reach for it. The Queen Consort admitted that its beauty had never been the real reason she wanted to wear it. She had wanted to wear the necklace just once so that the palace would finally stop treating her position as though it were borrowed. Years beside Charles had brought her title, responsibilities, and public recognition. Yet Diana's shadow still appeared to determine what Camilla could touch, what she was allowed to represent, and how the monarchy judged her place within the family. And listened without interrupting. Then she acknowledged the difficult reality Camilla had carried for years. Living after Diana meant constantly being compared with someone who could no longer respond, change, or make mistakes. But Anne warned her that taking possession of a protected symbol would never end those comparisons. It would only make them stronger. Wearing the necklace would not make the Queen Consort appear confident in her position. Instead, it could make the world believe that she needed something connected to Diana in order to prove that she belonged. The room became even quieter when Anne unfolded the handwritten note. She explained that the instruction had been kept inside the vault as a private document, meaning it represented Diana's personal wishes rather than an official public order. Then Anne read the message aloud. Diana never mentioned Camilla by name. She did not ask for revenge, nor did she demand that the jewels remain hidden permanently. Instead, she wanted the collection preserved for her sons, their future families, and public causes connected to vulnerable children. Those words transformed the jewels from a frozen reminder of the past into something intended for the future. Camilla finally understood. The collection had always been meant to move forward, but through Diana's children, not through the woman who came after her. The Queen Consort placed both hands beside the case and told Anne that she would withdraw every request she had made, and slowly turned the velvet box toward her. Camilla closed the clasp herself. The quiet click brought the conflict to an end more decisively than any formal royal order could have done. Before leaving the room, Camilla asked whether the palace would allow the public to believe that she had needed to be defeated before finally choosing to do the right thing. Their private confrontation had ended, but the denial was already beginning to reach the public, and the image attached to the story would determine whether Camilla appeared humiliated, punished, or finally truthful. By sunrise, the palace could no longer keep the story contained. One newspaper displayed Diana's sapphire necklace across its entire front page beneath 4 striking words, "And takes them back." Television presenters described the development as one of the most symbolic royal rejections in a generation. Outside Kensington Palace, people began placing blue flowers near Diana's gates before the palace had even released an official statement. The coppered denial register had reached the media through a leak from inside the royal household. It confirmed 2 details the palace could no longer minimize. Camilla's application had been officially rejected, and had assumed custody of the disputed collection. A denial register was the formal record documenting who had requested access, who had received approval, and who had been refused. Once that page became public, the situation no longer appeared to be a private disagreement. It became evidence of a deliberate royal boundary. Palace communication staff quickly began preparing 2 different statements. The first described the issue as a routine archival decision involving protected possessions. The second acknowledged the deeper reality, that Diana's jewels carried significant emotional meaning and had been preserved under a specific family commitment. The first statement protected the institution. The second risked exposing how badly the royal family had failed to resolve the past. Charles watched the morning coverage with the television volume turned low. The king remained motionless until photographs of Diana appeared alongside images of the sapphire necklace. Then he asked everyone except William to leave the room. Charles understood why the story had become so significant. The public was not simply debating who legally owned the collection. People were judging whether the palace had respected a woman whose position in royal history had already been disputed for decades. Camilla studied the newspaper front page without anger. Instead, exhaustion had replaced it. The Queen Consort instructed her secretary to cancel a scheduled public appearance because she refused to stand before cameras, while the palace attempted to hide behind procedural language. She understood that any forced smile could be interpreted as defiance, and any silence could be interpreted as shame. Meanwhile, the crowd outside Kensington Palace continued to grow. A young woman stepped forward and placed a handwritten card among the blue flowers. The message read, "These were never just jewels." That simple sentence quickly became the image repeated across broadcasts because it expressed what official palace wording could not. The collection represented memory, loss, and the fear that Diana's legacy might eventually be claimed by somebody else. Camilla then made her decision through an authorized recorded statement. She confirmed that she had withdrawn every request for access and accepted that the collection should eventually pass through Diana's sons and their families. The Queen Consort did not challenge Anne's authority. She ended the claim herself. William placed the two proposed palace statements in front of Charles. The prince watched as his father pushed the defensive version aside. Charles selected the more open statement and signed beneath a sentence recognizing Diana's lasting place within the monarchy. But William told him that acknowledgement alone was not enough. The family still needed to determine where the jewels would ultimately go and what purpose they would serve. The public had already delivered its judgment through flowers, headlines, and memories. But the final decision would be determined by what Anne chose to do with the collection now that the jewels were securely beyond Camilla's reach. Anne did not return the jewels to permanent storage. During a final gathering attended by Charles, William, and Camilla, she placed the collection on the table and announced what would happen to it permanently. The pieces would be protected for Diana's descendants, displayed in support of causes connected with her public service, and worn only with the shared approval of her sons' families. The dispute was finally over. Anne formalized the arrangement by establishing a protected legacy collection, a legal structure intended to keep significant possessions connected to an individual's memory and descendants rather than allowing them to become ordinary palace property. The Princess Royal made the purpose unmistakably clear. These jewels would not be distributed according to seniority. They would not move between royal wardrobes. And they would never be used simply to reinforce someone's status or position. Instead, they would remain connected to Diana's family and to the public causes that had shaped her life. William approved the arrangement immediately. The prince requested that selected pieces eventually appear at charitable events associated with homelessness, children's welfare, landmine awareness, and other causes closely linked with his mother's public work. He understood that permanently placing the jewels behind glass might preserve the physical objects, but it could also silence what they represented. Allowing the collection to support those causes would transform memory into meaningful action. Charles then spoke with controlled restraint, though his regret was difficult to conceal. The king acknowledged that the silence following Diana's death had allowed uncertainty to develop around possessions carrying enormous emotional significance. He admitted that the issue should have been resolved years earlier, before private grief turned into rivalry and before palace officials were given an opportunity to interfere. His failure had not created the entire dispute, but it had allowed the wound to remain unresolved. Camilla responded without attempting to defend herself. The Queen Consort declared that she would never request access to the collection again. She admitted that wearing Diana's jewels would never have strengthened her own position. Instead, it could have created the impression that her identity depended upon possessing something connected with Diana's story. For the first time, Camilla accepted that dignity could sometimes come from stepping away rather than claiming something that had already been refused. And then opened one final case. Inside rested a modest pearl clasp, far less dramatic than the sapphires and diamonds that had caused the conflict. According to Diana's handwritten instruction, the clasp was eventually intended for the first granddaughter in her direct family line who took part in official charitable service. The request contained no bitterness, only hope. William asked for the instruction to be included in the newly established legacy charter. A legacy charter was a permanent written record defining how the collection would be protected, managed, and used. The future king wanted every instruction properly documented so that no advisor, spouse, or palace official could ever remove, change, or quietly disregard Diana's wishes again, and closed the case. Then she handed the custodial key to William. He held it briefly before placing it beside Diana's signed note. Camilla stood, looked toward the collection one final time, and walked away without asking to touch any of the pieces. Anne's intervention was no longer viewed simply as an attack. Instead, it became the moment when the monarchy finally separated remembrance from rivalry. Diana's legacy remained protected. Camilla accepted the boundary, and Charles's household learned that genuine reconciliation required truth rather than possession. The vault finally closed with Diana's wishes preserved, Camilla's claim permanently withdrawn, and Anne's responsibility fulfilled. It demonstrated that the monarchy could only move forward once it stopped treating memory as something the living had the right to conquer. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.